We are joined by Jason Hanley, who is the Vice President of Education and Visitor Engagement at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland. Jason, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Hey, no problem. Thank you. Good morning, and happy St. Patrick's Day to all you guys.
And right back at you. Listen, how many people visit the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame every year?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot. The museum is a really fantastic place to visit, and we get somewhere in the neighborhood of about 500,000 people or more coming every year. And what's exciting to me is it's people from all over the United States, all around the world, travel to Cleveland, Ohio to visit the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Yeah, and for me, I was, after hearing all about Cleveland, and, you get the jokes about Cleveland, and people remind you about the water that burst into flame back in the 70s.
The city that time forgot, stuff like that.
It was a year named after it.
I loved Cleveland. I thought Cleveland was fantastic.
I agree with you, Pat. I'll tell you, I'm originally from New York myself, so I'm not a native Clevelander, and I have just really grown to love the city of Cleveland. It's a beautiful place. It's affordable. It's easy to live in. It's a really great town.
Yeah. Tell me about the process. What is the process of being considered for induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame?
So that's the $1 million question everybody always wants to talk about, right? Like what are the requirements? How do you get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? So there's really only one steadfast rule, and that's it has to be 25 years since your first recording, album, single, whatever the first thing you put out. So once you reach that 25 years, you're eligible. Now, the rest of it gets a little murky. It's different from something like, let's say, the Baseball Hall of Fame or the Football Hall of Fame. If you had so many home runs each season and you have so many career home runs or at-bats, that's going to put you in the running for the Baseball Hall of Fame.
Right.
In the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, we don't necessarily look at things like chart success or how many hit singles you have. What we're really talking about is the impact you had on rock and roll and music. Did you change something? Did you invent a new style? Did you push the music forward? And what was the impact you had on the greater world? What was, did your music influence different things around the world, change things in culture? And that's the sort of stuff we look at. And also, did you influence other musicians? The joke is you take a band like the Velvet Underground, they didn't sell a lot of records when you really look at it, but they influenced so many other musicians, right? To start bands and to become rock and roll musicians.
I mean, that's how you get to Dolly Parton.
Is it though? Right. Is that? I mean, that is one that confuses me a bit because there's a country Hall of Fame, right? That's where she seems to belong, and yet last year she was inducted into the Rock Hall of Fame.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And there's actually about, I think it's about 6 or 7 artists who are in both the Country Music Hall of Fame and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Because I'll give you a little bit better example for me. What I would say is I would consider Johnny Cash, one of the essential rock and roll artists. But he's also in the Country Music Hall of Fame because he's recorded so many records that are considered there. Now, with Dolly, what's interesting is her music tends to fit more in the countryside, but it's that influence piece, right? Think of how many artists have recorded, have talked about her, the impact she's had on music and culture. So with Dolly Parton, you're really thinking about somebody who had a larger impact on music and rock and roll music and rock and roll musicians. So it's not just the fact that she recorded, a bunch of bluegrass albums, which, by the way, has a big impact on rock and roll too. We've got Bill Monroe inducted as an early influence, the guy who started bluegrass music.
It's interesting, though, to me that rock artists would never be considered for the Country Hall of Fame, right? But
yes,
there's a couple of crossovers, right? He said,
are there any crossovers from rock? Like, are the Eagles, for instance, in the Country Hall of Fame? I don't think so.
The interesting thing, right? So here's the weird thing I always talk about with country music, particularly. If you sort of think of it, country is an ingredient you put into rock and roll, right? Country, along with the blues, rhythm and blues, gospel music, all of these things kind of blend in the early days in the 1940s and 50s to create rock and roll. So rock and roll is sort of an offshoot in many ways, or it has country built into it. But you're right, there are some artists who kind of go back the other way, the Eagles being a great example, right? Or the Byrds. You think about the Byrds, started as a psychedelic rock band and ended up, doing Sweetheart of the Rodeo, which is a fantastic kind of country record, right?
Yeah, yeah. So who decides this? Who decides who gets nominated, and then what is the process after they're nominated to induct?
So each year, the nominating committee, which is a group of about 40 folks who are musicians, some inductees, some journalists, scholars, a few music industry folks, they all meet and they look at the list, which is an ever-growing list, as you guys can imagine, right? Mm-hmm. A giant list of anyone who is eligible who meets those criteria I just talked about. And they create a ballot. And usually that ballot has anywhere from, 15 to 20 artists that get listed on there. Once that ballot is created, it goes out to a fan vote, which is up and online right now at rockhall.com, and the fans can go and vote and talk about what they want to see inducted. There are over 1,000 ballots that go out.
How much influence does that fan vote have, though?
If any, does it have any influence in the process?
The fan vote, and this is the part a lot of people talk about, it only counts as one official ballot. So all those fan votes get put into a ballot cast. But I'll tell you this, the sort of visibility of the fan vote has been what I think is the most interesting thing about the whole process. Because in the past, before we had that, a lot of people said, well, fans would have voted for somebody else. They would have voted for, Iron Maiden, and the voters are not going out and doing that because, again, there's about 1,000 voters who are voting. It's anybody who is an inductee. So, in fact, all the guys in Judas Priest and Dolly Parton are going to get a vote this year.
Right.
The fan vote is a great way to look at what people are voting for, what fan groups are coming out. This year, right now, George Michael is at the top of the fan vote because his fans have just come out and really supported him for induction into the Hall of Fame.
Mm-hmm. I once heard a story, and I think Paul McCartney told it, about calling Ringo Starr and saying, "Hey, you're not inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist. Would you like to be?" And Ringo Starr supposedly, obviously, said yes. And so McCartney talks about calling Bruce Springsteen, and they got the job done. Can that happen? Is that the process for some of these superstars?
No, not really. What Paul, I think, was referring to, and I know that story, it's kind of a famous story, is that he felt bad because the Beatles are all inducted, right? The Beatles were inducted fairly early on in the process. As you can imagine, you're not going to have a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame without the Beatles.
Right.
And all of the other guys, John, George, and Paul, were inducted also as solo artists. So Paul McCartney is inducted for all the great solo records.
Right.
So that conversation was between him and Ringo saying, like, hey, man, I feel bad for you that you're not inducted as a solo artist. What people can do, of course, like they can do in anything like that, is sort of lobby for it. So Paul just started talking to a lot of people saying, hey, Ringo's name should come up at some point for induction as a solo artist.
Ringo was
now,
pissed.
I will say what happened is Ringo got inducted under the category, the Award for Musical Excellence, which is not voted on. That is something that a committee of folks, scholars, artists, and others at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame can induct somebody in that category. And that's how Ringo got in. So I think Paul tells a good story, and it's
he does.
There's a basis of truth in there, right?
Okay.
He did have those conversations, but it's not like he flipped the switch and suddenly Ringo was inducted into the Hall of Fame.
Oh. Whatever you say. Whatever you say. I'm sure there's someone at the hall is going to pick up the phone when Paul calls.
Yeah, okay. I'm sure.
That's right. Exactly right.
Is McCartney also in with Wings? Is it Beatles, Wings, and so? Oh, he's not in with Wings.
No, in fact, the only example I have somebody who's in about 3 times is Clapton.
Eric Clapton.
He's inducted as a solo artist as the Yardbirds, and I just forgot the last one.
Cream, I believe.
There you go, Cream. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Now, my pet peeve project for years has been to get Foreigner inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. We heard one of the officials, I'm sorry, I don't remember who it was from the Rock Hall last year, that said they'd never even come up in the Not only have they not been nominated, but they've never even been mentioned to be nominated. How is that possible with an artist like that? Yeah,
well, I can't speak to that. I'll admit I'm not in the nominating room myself, but Man, I'll tell you, I think Foreigner's a fantastic band. I've always been a big fan of theirs too, and the formation of them in the 70s all the way up through their incredible string of hits in the 80s. And I have to admit, as somebody who was a Miami Vice fan in the 80s, Foreigner's music was a big deal on television too. Yeah, I think that's a band who absolutely could be part of the conversation, right? In fact, in that sort of category of big 70s and 80s arena rock, we did induct Journey.
Recently.
And they're sort of
Def Leppard.
They're sort of in that same Def Leppard. Yeah, exactly.
So you're not in the room when they, when they close the doors. But what do you hear in the hallways? what do you hear? Because I feel like there's got to be some kind of hall collusion going on.
Right. I'll tell you, that is true. We talk about it all the time, and I talk to artists who come to the museum and others about it, and that's the great thing. There's so many different musical styles that fit under rock and roll, and that's where a lot of people are passionate. Now, I think a band like Foreigner could get inducted someday, right? They've got all the impact and influence. They are a band that's been around long enough at this point. And I think what happens is because there's so many different sounds and styles, sometimes certain names bubble to the top. If recently Journey and, like we said, Def Leppard and other bands, were getting inducted, it may be that Foreigner didn't kind of get into the last part of that conversation. But that doesn't mean they won't, right? I mean, that's a conversation that can come up at any time. And I often tell people, this goes back to the kind of thing of, Paul McCartney maybe getting people interested in something or lobbying for it. That happened a few years ago. The great Sister Rosetta Tharpe, who was an early gospel blues guitar player. She's amazing. If you don't know her, look her up. She got inducted because there was sort of a resurgence in rediscovering her. There was a book that was done about her. There was a movie. Suddenly a lot of people were like, hell, how is this woman not inducted into the Rock Hall? She influenced so many other guitar players, including Chuck Berry and Jimi Hendrix. And there was sort of a groundswell for it. So I think that's the great thing, is that at any time, an artist is never uneligible for the Rock Hall. It's not like, we have to stop talking about Foreigner or some other bands and not induct them.
Until recently, there was scuttlebutt, and maybe it's just that there were certain artists that are sort of blackballed, and arena rock artists were among those. Yeah. But then, like we said, Journey and Def Leppard have been inducted. So wouldn't that open it up maybe for the Foreigner, Boston Styx type of bands? I mean, Boston was pretty influential, were they not?
Yes.
I mean, there was nothing like Boston before they came around.
No, you're right. I mean, Boston's an interesting group. They didn't have a ton of records, but that's not something that stopped you from getting inducted. The Sex Pistols really only had one album.
Right.
When you look at it, there's a lot of bootlegs.
Richie Valens.
A lot of live records.
Yeah,
Richie Valens, totally, right? So I think Boston, especially the work that Tom did there on recording and layering the guitars. Albums got
innovative.
You listen to those albums and you think that's all those vocal sounds, all those harmonies and layers. That's all just Brad singing. It's mind-blowing to think about that, right?
It really is.
Hi, Jason. This is Keith Malinak. You obviously have one of the coolest jobs in the world. And if I'm not mistaken, you've probably been at the Rock Hall for, is it 20 years now? I mean,
it's almost about 18 and a half years.
That's incredible, man.
Awesome.
So I would gather, and obviously I don't know all the ins and outs there. I don't pretend to, but I would gather that you have some bit of influence there. At least, you have connections within the building. And I just wonder if, as long as you're writing down Foreigner from Pat, you could also write down Tommy James and the Shondells, which I can't believe that there is a Rock Hall of Fame that doesn't have this band and that innovator, Tommy James, inducted, even mentioned. I don't understand that at all. And it just it leads to conspiracy theories. I mean, you mentioned the Beatles. You can't have a Rock Hall without the Beatles. Well, there's an individual in that band, George Harrison, I'm sure you've heard of, and he looked to Tommy James to record some stuff with because he was trying to invent a new sound based on the innovative spirit that Tommy James had brought to rock and roll. And if that's a big push, there is the influence that artists have on other artists. I got news here. over 300 musicians have recorded versions of Tommy James songs.
Totally.
You want to talk
Joan
about
Jett and Billy Idol and
having influence there, and that's not. Aside from the influence, listen, I know you know all of these hits that and I could go through all of them, but just here's a few that jump out: Hanky Panky, I Think We're Alone Now, Mony Mony, Crimson and Clover, Crystal Blue Persuasion, Dragging the Line. And to have this Rock and Roll Hall of Fame...
Those weren't all Tiffany songs? Weird. That's really weird.
And I just wonder,
Cardi B.
Okay.
If you're writing down, especially when you mentioned the, I forgot what term you use, legacy or something, like there's a special pathway for some of these artists. If we're not going to present him for official nomination, maybe we go that route, because that, I think, is a big miss on the part of the Rock Hall there.
All right, man. That was an impressive argument. I'm on board. And I'll tell you too. Look, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, it's not perfect, right?
Yeah. I got you.
We all know that.
I always joke in the beginning years when the museum first was doing its first induction ceremony in 1986, and they were like, "All right, who do we put on the ballot? Who do we induct?" And they were like, "Let's see, Elvis Presley, Fats Domino, Jerry Lee Lewis." I mean, it was a pretty easy list to come up with, right?
Yep.
Nowadays, you've got so much music to look at. And I will tell you, I'm actually in totally agreement with you 100% on the Tommy James and the Shondells thing. In fact, Tommy's an incredible guy. He's been to the museum. Wow. If you look at some of the history of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, he's kind of been a good friend of ours. He's performed at induction ceremonies. In fact, when Joan Jett played Crimson and Clover for her induction, Tommy was on stage with her. I personally interviewed Tommy James at the Rock Hall and did a career retrospective history of his music, the Shondells, what he wrote, what he was involved with in the early days. And I think you're right. And that, you mentioned too, we talked about sort of that category for musical excellence. That's really been in the last couple of years where the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame has been able to do that award, which counts as a full induction, by the way. Some people say, "Oh, well, is it not?" No, that's a full induction, but it's a way for us to say there's some of these artists that maybe have gotten overlooked in the voting process, and they're names that are hard to argue against. Like if Tommy James gets inducted, there's not going to be a lot of people out there saying he shouldn't be, right? So I think you're right. I think that's a name that's still out there, and I always say it's not chronological.
Yeah.
It feels like it should be. It feels like you should say you can't induct, let's say, Metallica until Iron Maiden is inducted, right? Because you kind of want to pay respect to the forefathers first, right?
Yeah.
And look, I'm one of those guys. I'm a big heavy metal fan, and I'm like, man, we got to get Iron Maiden inducted.
Right.
I'm still pulling, and I talk in the hallways, as you guys mentioned, about Motorhead all the time. I was a big fan of that, and got to know Lemmy from Motorhead pretty well before he passed away. But it's not chronological, and those names keep coming back. And you even see a band this year like the Spinners, great Philly soul band, are back on the ballot after having been there previously a few times and not getting inducted. So, I think you guys, Tommy James and Foreigner, are two good choices.
Yeah.
Is there a point at which you stop talking about a band? Maybe it's been too long. Like with the Baseball Hall of Fame, they stop nominating after a certain amount of
Ineligible.
years. Does that situation exist too at the Rock Hall of Fame, or
There is not, and I'll tell you, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, right? Because on one hand, with the Baseball Hall of Fame, because people, after so many years, they can't be nominated anymore, it does put a little bit of an urgency to get certain people in. It's like, hey, this is the last time so-and-so's eligible. If he doesn't get the votes this year, he's not going to get in, right? With the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, we don't do that. And the reason why, on the positive side of it, is that music is always changing.
Right.
There may be something that none of us can predict, that 5 years from now, there's going to be a whole new sound, a whole new type of rock and roll that's based off of an artist none of us even think of right now. It's somebody who's an obscure artist from the 70s or something, right? So you don't want to say, well, you've already passed the time for that person to be eligible. Things change. You can have an artist who maybe got nominated before, who didn't make it in, who sort of gets rediscovered, and people are reappreciating that music. So, because of the fact that rock and roll is always changing, this is when the museum first opened. People said, how can you make a museum about something that's still living and vibrant and is changing all the time? And it's true. And fans are passionate. That's the thing I love. when we started off, you asked about how many people come each year. That's my favorite part of the job, being here for 18 years, is the passion and excitement. Even when people are coming in and yelling at me and saying, "Why isn't Varner inducted?" You know, it's like,
right.
Man, I appreciate your passion for that. Like, that's awesome. That's why I've been here. That's why I work here.
Yeah.
You know, as a historian of rock and roll, that passion we all have for this music we love, that's what makes it matter in the end, right?
Yep. Absolutely.
100%.
Jason, it's been a pleasure. Appreciate your joining us. Vice President of Education and Visitor Engagement at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Pushing my luck if I say write down the Monkees, too, right?
You're pushing your luck with me, but I don't know about Jason.
That was a great time, man.
Jason, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Yeah,
and,
thank you, guys. Have a great day.
You too.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was fun.
Yeah, that was fun. And he was good about it.
Yeah.
He was a really good sport.
Yes.
And
what a cool job, man.
I like that. Very cool job. And you know what? It is fun to have that debate
It is.
on who belongs and who doesn't belong. And
it's nice to live
interesting.
in a country where we can argue about music acts. Do
Yes.
they belong in the Rock Hall or not? As opposed to, hey, how are we going to put food on the table tonight? You know, I mean,
because that may not always be the case.
exactly my point. I was just about to say that. How much longer are we
So
going to
thank heaven that for now, at least, we can argue about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.